Okay, so I want to talk about. So my chapter is on basically on the relationship between uh, psychoanalysis and existentialism, and I just want to give a little bit of background, and then I'll talk about the what I see as the central crux where they both divide and also come together, and it's my essay is not about love at all, sadly. Not that I'm not, I love talking about love, but this is just isn't doing that. So I came to psychoanalysis as an existentialist, so I was constantly trying to find ways to bring those two things together. But the thing that kept tripping me up, and that's the focus of my essay, is the relationship between existentialism and finitude and the the absolute no the absence of a discussion of finitude in psychoanalysis that I think for psychoanalysis, and I think the fact that when Freud says the unconscious is there's a timeless quality of the unconscious, that Freud's much more, that trauma for Freud is much more concerned with what is not bound by uh, time, and time isn't really so much of a factor because of not Treglodyte, because of the way in which the unconscious uh, endures, and the traumas of the unconscious endure. So I part of what I was trying to do was say, okay, how does that? Is there a way that we could integrate that into existentialist kind of thinking? And the other problematic was that of freedom, because for existentialism, obviously the fundamental point is that we're condemned to our, at least in the Sartrean uh, lingo, we're condemned to our freedom. And certainly Freud wouldn't think that. Freud is constant. He maybe says the word freedom a couple of times, but his main emphasis is about how a certain kind of necessity rules the psyche. And thinking about, in fact, he believes that free association works because there's a psychic necessity involved with things. So I, my attempt in this essay was to square the circle and to really, obviously the two things you can't inject finitude into psychoanalysis, nor can you inject infinitude into existentialism. But what I think you can do is change two things and reshape existentialism by thinking about the way in which the real problem of our existence is struggling with the infinite, not struggling with the fact that we're condemned to finitude. So that's the first step that I take. And then the second step is that I try to think about how Freud's the very point at which Freud denies that we are free, that there's that's some kind of psychic necessity at work. That's the point at which, no, actually, that's really where we have our freedom. And I think that for me, linking the unconscious to freedom is one of the fundamental, that's the this, I would say, the second step. So the first step, again, is to think, oh, how is it that our infinitude is is really our fundamental existential problem? And I think it's even true in our confrontation with death, because for someone like Sartre, death isn't so, and this is one of the big differences, as most people probably know, between Sartre and Heidegger, that for the Sartre of being and nothingness, death isn't really the fundamental problem of finitude. Finitude for him means more that we don't have our choices are always circumscribed, right? We don't have an infinite amount of time, especially time, or an infinite amount of possibilities. Instead, there's a finite amount of time and a finite amount of possibilities, and that very barrier. And this is a dialectical point on his part, that barrier is what gives us our freedom. So I think that's fundamental for Sartre. And then for Heidegger, it's actually our relationship to death that generates our freedom. So he'll later have a kind of allergy toward discussing freedom, but within being in time, within Sein und Zeit, he says anticipation reveals to Dasein its lostness in the they and brings it face to face with the possibility of being itself in an impassioned, this is the key term, an impassioned freedom towards death. So that freedom, he thinks, is what frees us or releases us from the they, the power of the they, the power of conformity, basically, the power of social authority. And so for both of them, freedom, for both Sartre and Heidegger, freedom is tied in some essential sense to our temporality. For Sartre, it's our temporal ecstasy, like our temporal removal constantly out of ourselves, either toward the past or toward the future, or even relative to the present. And in fact, he goes through all those different temporalities and being in nothingness. Um, for Heidegger, it's much more just our real. It's a freedom in relationship to death. But in each case, and I think this is essential to how they conceive of. And Heidegger, just to be clear, Heidegger would never accept the moniker and openly disavowed the moniker existentialist. But I think for this discussion, it's pretty clear he and Sartre are more or less on the same page, especially relative to psychoanalysis. Uh, and but freedom for both of them is tied to our temporality, and you can't take it and thus our finitude, the fact that we don't have an infinite amount of time or an infinite amount of possibilities. If we did, we wouldn't be free because we wouldn't have to choose one, right? So we wouldn't have to define in Sartre's terms, we wouldn't have to define a project. We wouldn't have to choose a project because we would have an infinite amount of space and time to choose any project we wanted. We can say there'd be no demand. We wouldn't have there'd be no sense in which we were condemned to freedom. So infinitude is for both Sartre and Heidegger a allergy. It's anathema to freedom. Okay, so what I find really uh, great about the psychoanalytic intervention and Freud's intervention, especially, is that and he sees the way in which that what causes that in our conscious activity we are following, and this gets more directly theorized by Lacan, I think. In our conscious activity, we're following the demands that the other places on us, right? We're capitulating in some way or another. But, and I think this is where Lacan's sense of our desire as the desire of the other is really important, that in the way that we interpret the demands that the social authority makes on us, that's where our freedom lies, because our interpretation is always incorrect. Well, it's incorrect in a sense because the other doesn't know there's no other of the other. The other doesn't know what it wants when it makes some command to us. But we also don't know what it wants. So we have to interpret what that desire of the other is. And this happens, I think this is clear, it happens unconsciously. So the point is that your freedom emerges through the very way in which you create some kind of unconscious interpretation of what the other has demanded of you. And so this is where I think it's a very, to me, incredible point at which psychoanalysis doesn't just take up an existentialist project of freedom, but actually shows how, you know, freedom is not just linked as I think we always think. We think, oh, free will, like that freedom is tied to consciousness. But instead, from the psychoanalytic perspective, freedom is precisely tied to our unconscious response to the other's desire, to what the other is asking of us, right? And I think that's from the psychoanalytic perspective, that's what really is a value added to the existentialist project because it takes it out of the realm of consciousness where I think it's trapped in a voluntarist or a decisionist kind of philosophical position that has some, I think, serious problems. So for me, that's what's incredible and what's miraculous about the psychoanalytic intervention in the existentialist project and how we can think of them together as married. And then that means, I think, if you think of freedom not as located in consciousness, but in precisely in our unconscious response to what the other desires of us, then it's not it's not that freedom is not linked to our no longer linked to our finitude, but actually becomes part of it because it's linked to the unconscious. It becomes part of our infinitude. And I think this will come back to the problem of death, that I think one way to think psychoanalytically about death, for instance, is to think, why is death a problem? Is it because we are finite beings? That's what Heidegger thinks. He absolutely thinks that. But I think, and it's Alenka Zupančič who really got me thinking in this direction, that I think it's actually our infinitude that makes death a problem for us. That we're constantly putting ourselves beyond it. We're able to transcend it in certain ways, to think beyond the point, that end point. That's what makes death traumatic for us in a way that it's not for a being that doesn't have the infinitude of the unconscious as part of its psychic structure. And so I think that's for me that's the real breakthrough of psychoanalysis is to do this double to shift the problem of freedom away from consciousness to the unconscious, and to see how it's really in our unconscious response. And obviously, in our unconscious response, that freedom is articulated. Obviously, there are points at which the unconscious is even more prone to capitulate than we would be consciously, right? So it's clear those moments do happen, that we unconsciously obey when we're consciously trying to strive to or to not conform. But I think even then, I would bite the bullet on this. Even then, I think there's something in the unconscious response that is if the obedience is it's we're doing so freely, if we do so unconsciously, that there's something in the way in that the unconscious responds, because it's always our interpretation, again unconscious, of the other's desire, that there's this disjunction between what's been demanded of us and how we respond to it. And I think that's the gap of freedom from my perspective. And I think it's a way also to get beyond this question of free will, which I always kind of, it always makes me feel a little taken aback when I hear even the term or the debate about free will. Oh, is there this gap moment of free will? But I think if you align freedom not with will, but with desire and with the unconscious, then I think it's a way of I don't know, circumventing that problem of the very question of determinism and freedom, I think. And then again, the second point would be to turn away from the problem of finitude to the question of the infinite, and to see how our infinitude, and this maybe connects back. I like what Julie said about the connection always between death and love. And I think maybe this is where that comes back together, because it's through our infinitude that we're capable of loving. And so I think there's a way in which that thinking about our relationship to death in that way makes the connection to love even more profound. Anyway, so that's what originated my essay, and that's what drove it. And it's again, this has been a project of mine, trying to bring together psychoanalysis and existentialism. So I was really happy when Julie said, "Oh, you could write on that for this." I'm like, "Could I? I don't know." And she said, "Okay." And it's sort of the basis of what I want to do next as a huge project too. So, yeah, that's it. And I'd be happy to answer anybody's question or talk further if Julie has something or if anybody has something.